Welcome. I am Melesias. Today, we are stepping into a world of candlelit ballrooms, elegant country estates, and a quiet, desperate battle for a suitable marriage. But do not be fooled by the beautiful dresses and the polite conversation. Beneath this glittering surface lies a world of fierce social maneuvering, of devastating wit, and of a love story so perfectly constructed that it has become the template for nearly every romance written since. We are opening Pride and Prejudice, the masterpiece of a quiet, observant, and profoundly brilliant woman named Jane Austen. Jane Austen was the seventh child of a country clergyman. She never married. She lived her entire life, with the exception of a few brief trips, within the quiet, green confines of the English countryside. Her world was small. She knew the inside of ballrooms, the drawing rooms of country estates, and the long, whispered conversations between sisters in the dead of night. And within this limited sphere, she became one of the greatest observers of human nature who ever lived. She wielded her pen like a scalpel, dissecting the follies of her society, its obsession with wealth, its rigid class structures, its absurd marriage market, with a wit so sharp and so perfectly timed that her novels still feel shockingly modern, 2 centuries later. She wrote about love. But more importantly, she wrote about the difficult, painful, and ultimately beautiful process of learning to see another person clearly. The book opens with a sentence so famous, so perfectly ironic, that it is often quoted by people who have never even read the novel. It is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune, must be in want of a wife. The brilliance of this line is that Austen means the exact opposite. It is not the single man who is in want. It is the surrounding families, with their unmarried daughters, who are in desperate want of his fortune. And no family is in more desperate want than the Bennets. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 daughters. Their estate, Longbourn, is entailed away to a distant male cousin. When Mr. Bennet dies, his wife and daughters will be left with nothing. The only escape from this looming catastrophe is a good marriage, or several. And so, when a single man of large fortune, a Mr. Bingley, is reported to have taken the nearby estate of Netherfield Park, Mrs. Bennet, a woman of tireless energy and absolutely no self-awareness, immediately begins to scheme. The game, as they say, is afoot. Part 1. A single man of large fortune arrives in the neighborhood. The news of Mr. Bingley's arrival throws the entire household of Longbourn into a state of frantic anticipation. The preparations for the upcoming assembly ball are all-consuming. Mrs. Bennet, a woman of unshakable optimism where her daughter's matrimonial prospects are concerned, declares that Bingley is certain to fall in love with Jane, the eldest, who is also the most beautiful. Mr. Bennet, a man who has retreated from his chaotic family into a world of quiet, sarcastic amusement, takes a perverse pleasure in doing the opposite of what his wife wants. He refuses to visit Mr. Bingley, a necessary social prerequisite, just to torture her. And then, casually, he reveals that he has, in fact, already visited him, and that Bingley is delighted with the Bennets. The first battle is won. The ball is a triumph for the family, or at least for Jane. Bingley dances with her twice, a clear and public sign of his admiration. He is charming, amiable, and everything a wealthy young bachelor should be. His friend, however, is a very different sort of man. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy is taller, darker, and, it is whispered, possesses twice the fortune of his friend. He owns the magnificent estate of Pemberley in Derbyshire, one of the finest in England. But his wealth is matched only by his pride. He dances only twice, with the 2 women of his own party, and when Bingley suggests he dance with Elizabeth Bennet, the second eldest sister, Darcy utters a sentence that will seal his reputation for the rest of the evening. Elizabeth, he says, looking directly at her across the room, is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. The words are overheard by Elizabeth herself. And the first, deep, and perfectly formed seed of prejudice is planted. She is not heartbroken. She is amused. She has a fierce, intelligent, and independent spirit, and she has just found the perfect target for her wit. Elizabeth Bennet is not like her sisters. She is her father's favorite, possessing his sharp wit and his keen sense of the ridiculous. She is fiercely loyal, deeply observant, and possesses a stubborn independence that refuses to be cowed by wealth or status. She sees Darcy's insult not as a wound, but as a challenge. And the truth, which she cannot yet see, is that Darcy, for all his pride, is beginning to notice her. He watches her. He listens to her sharp, intelligent conversation. And he finds, against his will, that he is fascinated. The battle between Pride and Prejudice has begun. And the arrival of a charming, handsome, and utterly deceitful young officer, Mr. George Wickham, is about to pour fuel on the fire. Part 2, The Deepening of Prejudice. The arrival of the militia in the small town of Meryton was a social earthquake. For the Bennet sisters, and for their impressionable youngest sibling Lydia in particular, the presence of so many dashing young men in their red coats was a source of endless excitement. But for Elizabeth, it was the introduction to one specific officer, a Mr. George Wickham, that proved to be the most significant event of the entire summer. Wickham was everything Darcy was not. He was handsome, with a warm, open, and instantly likable manner. He was charming, possessed of a ready smile and a gift for making everyone he spoke to feel special. And when he and Elizabeth met on the street, he was quick to share a story, a deeply personal and painful story, of a terrible injustice he had suffered. It was a story about Mr. Darcy. Wickham confided in Elizabeth that he was the son of the late Mr. Darcy's trusted steward, and that the elder Darcy had been a second father to him. He had been promised a comfortable living, a parsonage on the Pemberley estate, as his inheritance. But upon the old man's death, the younger Darcy, Fitzwilliam, had coldly and cruelly denied him this legacy, leaving him destitute and forcing him into the militia for survival. The story was told with such a convincing mixture of hurt, humility, and quiet dignity that Elizabeth, already predisposed to think the very worst of Darcy, believed every single word without question. Her prejudice, like a seed planted in the richest soil, began to bloom into a mighty and unshakable tree. She now had not one, but two solid reasons to despise the man from Derbyshire. He was an arrogant snob who had insulted her, and he was a cruel, unfeeling tyrant who had destroyed the life of a far better man. The news that Bingley and his party had suddenly quit Netherfield for London, with no plans to return, was a devastating blow to the Bennet household. Jane, quiet, graceful, and deeply private, was heartbroken. She had truly loved Bingley, and the sudden, unexplained abandonment confirmed everyone's worst fears. He had never been serious. Elizabeth, however, was not simply sad. She was furious. She was convinced, with a certainty born of her own growing, bitter prejudice, that Darcy was the architect of this misery. Bingley, she reasoned, was too amiable, too weak-willed to have made such a decision on his own. It was Darcy who had separated them, out of snobbery, out of a desire to see his friend marry into a more prestigious family. This was the final, unforgivable crime. Every piece of evidence, every whispered rumor, every proud glance from Darcy, now formed a single, coherent, and utterly damning picture in her mind. He was the villain of her story. And yet, the very object of her hatred was, in the privacy of his own mind, fighting a battle of a completely different nature. Fitzwilliam Darcy, the proud, cold master of Pemberley, was falling in love. He was a man who had built his entire life on principles of order, decorum, and the absolute superiority of his own judgment. But he was being drawn, against his will, against his reason, and against his very character, to a woman who was socially inferior, whose family was a daily source of embarrassment, and who openly despised him. He found himself watching her at every gathering, listening for the sound of her voice, and admiring the intelligence and fire in her dark, fine eyes. He was, in short, completely and utterly captivated. He hated himself for it, but he could not stop. The crisis came during a visit Elizabeth paid to her newly married friend, Charlotte Lucas, who had made a practical, if loveless, marriage to the pompous and ridiculous clergyman, Mr. Collins. The Collinses lived on the estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a woman of immense wealth and even more immense self-importance. And Lady Catherine, as it turned out, was Mr. Darcy's aunt. It was at Rosings Park, the great mansion, that Elizabeth once again found herself thrown into Darcy's company. He sought her out. He made stilted, awkward conversation. He followed her on her walks through the grounds. She was bewildered by his strange, brooding attention. And then, one evening, when she was alone, he entered the room. He was agitated, his face pale, his manner abrupt. He stood before her, and with a passion that was both terrifying and strangely moving, he declared his love. He told her he admired and loved her. And then, in the very same breath, he told her that he had struggled against this love in vain. He spoke of her family's inferiority, of the degradation of such a match, of all the reasons why he should never have allowed himself to feel this way. It was a proposal that was also, devastatingly, an insult. Elizabeth's response was immediate, fierce, and utterly devastating. She told him, with a cold and trembling fury, that he was the last man in the world she could ever be prevailed upon to marry. She accused him of ruining the happiness of her beloved sister, Jane. And she accused him of the cruel, unjust, and despicable treatment of Mr. Wickham. Darcy, his face white with shock, absorbed the blows. He asked her, in a strangled voice, if these were the only reasons for her rejection. Her final words were a sword through his heart. I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. He left the room without another word. The declaration, which he had built up to with such agonizing hope, had been a catastrophe of the highest order. The pride had been laid low, and the prejudice had erupted with volcanic force. And now, both of them would have to face the truth of what they had done. Part 3, The Letter and the Collapse of a Prejudice. The morning after his disastrous proposal, Elizabeth, still reeling from the confrontation, sought solitude in the quiet lanes around Rosings Park. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, fury at his arrogance, humiliation at being so insulted even in the act of a proposal, and a strange, unwelcome tremor of something she refused to name. It was then that she saw him. Mr. Darcy, approaching her on the path. He said nothing. He simply handed her a thick, folded letter, looked at her one last time with an expression she could not decipher, and then turned and was gone. The letter was not a love letter. It was a defense. A quiet, methodical, and devastatingly calm account of the two great charges she had leveled against him, the separation of Jane and Bingley, and the ruin of Mr. Wickham. First, Darcy addressed the case of Jane and Bingley. He did not deny that he had urged his friend to leave Netherfield and forget about Jane Bennet. But his reasoning, when laid out with cold, uncomfortable honesty, was not born of pure snobbery. He had observed the Bennets closely. He had seen the vulgarity of Mrs. Bennet, the wild, ungovernable behavior of the younger sisters, and the complete indifference of Mr. Bennet. He had seen Jane's serene, unreadable calm and had genuinely, if wrongly, believed that her heart was not truly engaged. He had been trying to protect his friend from what he saw as an imprudent and potentially disastrous marriage. It was a terrible, humiliating truth. Her own family's behavior, which she had always tried to ignore, had been the primary evidence against her sister. The first, great pillar of her prejudice began to crack. Then, he addressed the case of George Wickham. And the truth he revealed was nothing short of a complete and total revolution of everything Elizabeth thought she knew. The man she had defended, the charming, wronged officer, was, in reality, a liar, a gambler, and a predator. Wickham had, of course, refused the living that Darcy's father had left him. But not because of any cruelty. He had asked for, and received, a sum of £3,000 in exchange for it, a fortune he then proceeded to squander in a life of idleness and vice. When the money was gone, he demanded the living back. When Darcy refused, he vowed revenge. And his revenge was not just a campaign of slander. It was something far more sinister. The previous summer, he had secretly courted Darcy's 15-year-old sister, Georgiana. He had convinced her, a shy and innocent girl, that she was in love with him. He had arranged an elopement, with the sole purpose of gaining access to her £30,000 dowry. Darcy had discovered the plot just in time to prevent it. The charming Mr. Wickham was not a victim. He was a fortune-hunting seducer of the most despicable kind. Elizabeth read the letter, and then she read it again. And then again. Her first instinct was to disbelieve it, to cling to her long-held prejudice, to dismiss the letter as a self-serving lie. But she could not. She was too intelligent, too honest for that. The pieces, which had been scattered in her mind, now clicked into place with a sickening, inexorable logic. She remembered the look on Wickham's face when she had mentioned Darcy's name at their first meeting, a flicker of something dark and calculating. She remembered that he had told her his story, a deeply personal and damaging story, to a stranger he had known for less than an hour. She remembered that he had waited until Darcy had left the neighborhood before making his accusations public. And she saw, with a horrifying clarity, that she had been a fool. A complete, utter, and willing fool. She had been so blinded by her prejudice against Darcy, and so seduced by Wickham's charm, that she had abandoned every principle of good judgment. How despicably I have acted, she cried to herself. I, who have prided myself on my discernment. Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. Part 4, The Transformation, Pemberley and the Crisis. Months passed. The wound of the letter slowly healed, transforming from a source of shame into a strange, quiet well of reflection. Elizabeth did not see Darcy again. She did not know if she ever would, or what she would say if she did. That summer, an opportunity arose to travel north with her aunt and uncle, the Gardiners. They were sensible, kind, and refined people, a stark contrast to much of her immediate family. Their planned tour of the Peak District promised a welcome escape from the petty dramas of Longbourn and Meryton. As they journeyed, her aunt suggested a small detour. They were only a few miles from Pemberley, the great estate of Mr. Darcy. Mrs. Gardiner, who had grown up in the area, was eager to see it again. The house, she assured Elizabeth, was magnificent, and the grounds were some of the finest in the country. Elizabeth's heart lurched. She could not confess the true reason for her reluctance. She made her aunt swear to confirm, multiple times, that the family was absolutely, positively away from home. And so, with a mixture of deep, fearful curiosity and a strange, fluttering anticipation, she agreed. The moment she saw Pemberley, Elizabeth was captivated. It was not just the beauty of the place. It was the feeling of it. The woods were thick and verdant, the stream was clear and natural, the hills rose and fell with a gentle, unforced grace. There was no false ornamentation, no artificial grandeur. The house itself was large and handsome, standing proudly on a rising ground, its great stone facade reflected perfectly in the still water of the lake. It was, she thought with a sudden, sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like regret, a place where one could be truly happy. A place that perfectly mirrored the true character of the man she had so thoroughly misjudged. The housekeeper, a kind, elderly woman who had known Darcy since he was a boy, was their guide. And it was her words that completed the transformation. She spoke of her master not with the cold respect of a servant, but with a warm, glowing affection. He was, she declared, the best landlord, and the best master, that ever lived. He was not like the other wild young men of his generation. He was sweet-tempered, generous, and beloved by all his tenants and servants. Elizabeth listened in a state of profound, bewildered astonishment. The proud, arrogant monster of her imagination was, in the eyes of the woman who knew him best, a man of extraordinary goodness. And then, as if conjured by her own racing thoughts, he appeared. Darcy, returned unexpectedly from his travels. He was walking towards them on the gravel path, and Elizabeth's blood ran cold with shock and mortification. She had been caught, trespassing in his home, in his very soul. But the man who stood before her was not the cold, haughty figure from the ballroom or the tortured, awkward man who had proposed so disastrously. He was calm, gentle, and solicitous. He asked after her family with a kindness that seemed entirely genuine. He spoke to her aunt and uncle with a politeness that acknowledged them as equals, a gesture that was, given his status, nothing short of extraordinary. He was not trying to impress her. He was, she realized with a dawning, heart-stopping wonder, simply being himself. The transformation was complete. Prejudice had been replaced by admiration. Dislike was rapidly, terrifyingly, giving way to something far deeper. For the first time, she saw him clearly. And she was falling in love. But the moment of grace was shattered by a catastrophe. A letter arrived from Jane. Its contents were frantic and horrifying. Their youngest sister, the reckless, foolish, and utterly ungovernable Lydia, had eloped. She had run off with Mr. Wickham. The scandal was absolute. Lydia was 16. She had no money, no sense, and had thrown herself away on a man who had no intention of marrying her. The Bennet family was, in the eyes of society, ruined. All their daughters would be tainted by the disgrace. Elizabeth, her face white with shock, was discovered by Darcy in a state of utter, helpless despair. She told him everything. She had no reason to. He could not help. And yet, the distress on her face was more than he could bear. He listened in a grim, heavy silence. He said very little. And then, with a look of quiet, terrible determination, he left. He would go to London. He would find them. The man she had once accused of pride and cruelty was about to perform an act of staggering generosity and self-sacrifice, all for a woman whose family he had every reason to despise. Part 5, Pride and Prejudice, Vanquished. The days that followed were an agony of waiting. The Bennet household was plunged into a state of chaos and despair. Mr. Bennet rushed to London to find his wayward daughter, but failed. Mrs. Bennet took to her bed, her nerves in tatters, blaming everyone but herself. The house was a tomb of shame and bitter recrimination. And through it all, Elizabeth carried a secret, burning knowledge. She had told Darcy of her family's disgrace, and she believed she had seen the last of him. What man of his position, she thought with a cold, sinking certainty, would ever align himself with a family so thoroughly ruined? The silence from him was a confirmation of her worst fears. She had lost him, before she had even fully understood that she wanted him. And then, a miracle. A letter arrived from their uncle, Mr. Gardiner. Lydia and Wickham had been found. Wickham, it turned out, had no intention of marrying Lydia. He had massive gambling debts and had fled Brighton with her for sport, planning to abandon her when he tired of her. But he had been tracked down, and somehow, impossibly, convinced to marry her. The debts were paid, a small annual income was settled on him, and the wedding was arranged. The Bennet family was saved. Elizabeth, like everyone else, assumed her uncle had paid the debts. She wrote to her aunt, begging for an explanation. The truth, when it came, was a bombshell. It was not Mr. Gardiner who had found them. It was not he who had paid the debts. It was Mr. Darcy. He had gone to London, found the couple, and, at great personal expense and an even greater cost to his pride, had forced Wickham to marry Lydia. He had sworn the Gardiners to secrecy, asking for no thanks, no acknowledgement, and no credit. Elizabeth, reading the letter in a state of breathless wonder, understood the full, staggering magnitude of what he had done. He had done it for her. The proudest man of her acquaintance had humbled himself, not for glory, but for love. The crisis was resolved. Lydia, utterly unashamed and blissfully ignorant of the chaos she had caused, returned to Longbourn as a married woman, loudly proclaiming her triumph. She let slip a careless remark. Darcy, she said, had been at her wedding. Elizabeth was desperate to know more, to thank him, to tell him what was in her heart. But he was gone, retreated back to his own world. And then, a new storm arrived. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, the great-aunt of Mr. Darcy, descended upon Longbourn in a magnificent and terrifying fury. She had heard a rumor, an impossible, scandalous rumor, that her nephew was planning to propose to Elizabeth Bennet. She confronted Elizabeth in the garden, demanding she deny the rumor and promise never to accept him. Elizabeth, with a cold, magnificent dignity, refused. She would not be intimidated. She would not lie. She sent the great lady away in a towering rage. And Darcy, hearing of her magnificent, defiant response, understood that there was still hope. He came to her. Not with the tortured, arrogant passion of his first proposal, but with a quiet, humble, and deeply hopeful uncertainty. He had to know. Everything he had done because he could not bear to see her unhappy. But her feelings, he now knew, might have changed. He asked, simply, directly, if she could ever love him. And Elizabeth, her heart overflowing with a love that had been born in the ashes of her prejudice, told him everything. She thanked him, with tears in her eyes, for saving her sister. She confessed how deeply, how completely, her feelings had changed. She told him she loved him. And the proud, lonely man from Pemberley, and the fiercely intelligent, stubborn woman from Longbourn, were finally, truly, united. Epilogue: Why we love this story. The two couples were married on the same morning. Jane, the beautiful and serene, to her amiable Bingley. And Elizabeth, the brilliant and courageous, to her transformed Darcy. The great house of Pemberley, which Elizabeth had first seen with a pang of regret, became her home. And the man she had once sworn was the last man in the world she could ever marry, became the very first in her heart. Jane Austen, with her quiet, devastating wit, did not write a fairy tale. She wrote a story about two deeply flawed, intelligent people who had to learn, through pain and humiliation, to see themselves and each other clearly. Darcy had to conquer his pride. Elizabeth had to conquer her prejudice. And in doing so, they earned the love that they found. This is why the story endures. Because it is not just a romance. It is a mirror. It asks us to consider our own blind spots, our own quick judgments, our own pride. It is a story about the courage it takes to change, and the grace that is given when we do. I am Melesias. This has been the story of Pride and Prejudice, as I have understood it. Thank you for listening. If this journey through ballrooms and heartbreak has moved you, please subscribe. And remember, the first judgment is rarely the truest one. Until next time.